Hi everyone, this is my second article review project for Psych of Music. My article was called A Distribution of Absolute Pitch Ability Through Computerized Testing in Music Perception. So why this was significant? Because absolute pitch is not very well understood, and there also exists no standardizing testing measure at the time of the publication. So the test that they come up with was on the computer, and participants would hear stimuli through the headphones. This consisted of music students, all with 10 years of training, as you can see, mostly male, and consisted of musicians both that identified as having absolute pitch and self-identified as not having AP, and also a variety of instrumental backgrounds. So the pitches that were tested ranged from C3 to B5. They would be artificially generated, which means that it would remove any sort of bias that a musician might have towards a different instrument. The familiarity wouldn't be there. So it was unfamiliar to everyone, the timbre of the tone, basically. So the first part, they had to do a pitch identification. They would hear a pitch, and the sequences would be in random order in a variety of different volumes. They didn't have a time limit, however, the reaction time was measured, and that will factor into the data a little bit later. The cursor would always start right here in the middle where the plus sign is, so that all of 12 semitones were equally accessible to remove any sort of bias or accessibility issue. Second part of the test is that they had to mark which octave the sound occurred. They didn't have to be specific as to where exactly on the grand staff the sound was, but they had to at least mark the octave. So the results were pretty interesting. They had no variation within octave identification between absolute pitch and non-AP participants. The highest level performers, though, all responded within 6 seconds as well, which is just important why reaction time is important. So the data shows, obviously, probably no surprise, AP subjects were more accurate than non-AP subjects. The AP musicians were higher performing, but their octave identification was not always necessarily equal to non-absolute pitch. One thing that is really interesting is that all AP musicians were able to identify the white key notes, so the ones in the C diatonic scale, quicker and more accurately. However, and the pitch class A had the highest accuracy of them all, as well as the fastest reaction time. Versus non-absolute pitch musicians, pitch class A was still most accurate, but not always the fastest reaction time, and white and black keys didn't seem to play a factor into how accurately they were able to identify the pitch. So what was interesting about this data is it allowed us to see kind of a spectrum of results. Previous AP tests would just, give a point for correct or a point for incorrect, minus a point for incorrect. But what we learned is that actually there was kind of an intermediate level of performance where they would score pretty high for pitch ID, still had the higher accuracy for A, but also a longer reaction time, which means that there might exist a subset of people within the absolute pitch category who may have memorized, for example, A, but then were using strategies to figure out the other pitches through relativity. So basically, they have relative pitch, but think they have AP because they've memorized like one or two. Because the highest level performing musicians they all had reaction times less than 6 seconds. So that means they didn't have time to strategize. They heard F sharp and they were like, oh, that's F sharp. So they had this intermediate pseudo AP, what the article called, had a longer reaction time. So that's my article. Another thing that was interesting was the thing about the white keys having higher accuracy lends itself to think that early childhood experience played a key factor in determining the role AP plays in musicians' life. Bye.